Howdy kids, today I'd like to start a new series wherein we all learn more about story structure and screenwriting through cult films, B-pictures, and horror flicks. Since this is dropping on Friday the 13th, why not begin with, well, Friday the 13th. I've covered the 1980 film and its sequels on my channel before, so we'll forgo a review other than to say, hey, it slaps pretty hard. So let's get into the nitty-gritty and break down Friday the 13th by its 8 sequences. Oh, spoiler warning, by the way. If you somehow are watching this and haven't seen Friday the 13th, go do that. Otherwise, you might get lost. So, I'm not gonna waste time explaining every little detail, so go get that freshly in your noggin. Get! According to Paul Galino in his book Screenwriting, the sequence approach, quote, the first 15 minutes of a picture answer the questions of who, what, when, where, and under what conditions the picture will take place. Now, curiosity is often used to open a film. In Friday the 13th, this is the killing of the 2 counselors in 1958. Our minds immediately spring into action. Who killed these teens? Why? Now, Galino goes on to explain that the stronger the sense of flow of life at the beginning of the picture, the bigger the impact of the destabilizing events that intrude to make the story happen. Friday the 13th does a solid enough job here, as well by introducing our entire core cast within the first sequence, which stretches from that opening scene to almost exactly 15 minutes in with the arrival of Jack, Ned, and Marcy. This also marks our introductions to Alice, our protagonist, and Steve Christie, who, as the owner of the camp, is also the one we will learn instigated what's going to happen by choosing to reopen Camp Crystal Lake. But before any of that, we're also introduced to Annie, who is hitchhiking through town and gives us our initial setup and states the theme. Get out while you still can.
You'll never come back again.
Listen to the warnings, of which she receives 2 direct ones, both from Crazy Ralph and from Enos, who tells her that she should quit and that the place is jinxed. Which, yeah. Honestly, I'd be out of there. Fuck it.
Did Christie tell you about the 2 kids murdered in 58? Huh? Boy drowning in 57?
So we have our who, the counselors, the what, murder, the when, present day, 1980, and where, Camp Crystal Lake, which is jinxed.
Quit!
I can't.
And the basic conditions or rules that the counselors are breaking by trying to reopen the camp. Sequence 2 features the protagonist spending their time, quote, attempting to grapple with the destabilizing element introduced into his or her life during the first 15 minutes. This leads to a bigger problem, quote, marking the end of the first act and setting up the main tension. This is also the shortest sequence in Friday the 13th, running roughly from the 17-minute mark to Annie's death 22 minutes in. It's also probably the most messy, as not a whole lot happens other than our learning that the counselors know about Camp Blood, that they don't take it seriously, and oh yeah, that there's a killer on the loose. While it's not a wellspring of content, the sequence poses the question of whether the counselors are in over their heads, and promptly answers it with one hell of a Tom Savini throat slash. Sequence 3 begins with the counselors having a good old time on the lake. Brenda sees someone watching them, but ignores it, and for all we know, it could be the killer. But our suspicions could be wrong. After Alice finds a snake in her room and relies on Bill to kill it, a cop arrives to warn the group about Crazy Ralph snooping around. Now, sure enough, Ralph shows up moments later, inexplicably hiding in the pantry.
I'm the messenger of God.
He tells them they're all doomed, just like he told Annie. So, was it Ralph watching the nubile teens earlier, or was it the killer? We're not really sure. Per Galino, the third 15-minute sequence of a picture allows the protagonist a first attempt at solving the problem posed at the end of the first act. Now, the issue with a slasher movie is that usually the protagonist isn't aware of their problem, and so we can take this 2 different ways. The first is if we consider Alice's problem to be whether or not she'll stay on to help with the camp, or head back to California to deal with whatever issue that she vaguely discusses with Christie.
All right, Friday. I'll give it a week.
It's unclear whether she actually has a problem to deal with back in Cali, or if she's just questioning being around Steve, who she seems to have maybe had a fling with, perhaps even the night before.
Do I really look like that?
You did last night.
Either way, she's questioning whether or not to stay, and that's her problem, at least for now.
I don't know if I'm gonna last all week.
It's never really brought up again in any meaningful way because of, spoilers, all the murder. Anywho, the first attempt at solving the problem is Alice choosing to enjoy herself with her fellow teens and seemingly growing closer to Bill in sequence 3. The other way we could take this is that the first attempt is foisted upon Alice and the rest of the counselors when Ralph warns them that they're all doomed if they stay. Interestingly, this sequence also provides us with a possible motivation to the killings, with Officer Dorff remarking,
"We ain't gonna stand for no weirdness out here."
just before riding off, per orders from Chief Tierney. Could it be that the townsfolk, or at least the police, are in on the murders? Of course not, but a first-time viewer paying careful attention might suspect them. Now, for those keeping track, this sequence ends with Ralph riding off at the 31-minute mark. Back to Galino's book, he states the end of the fourth sequence very often leads to the first culmination or midpoint culmination of a film. This may be a revelation or some reversal of fortune that makes the protagonist's task more difficult. Successfully realized scripts at this juncture often give the audience a very clear glimpse of an answer to the dramatic question. The hope that the protagonist will actually succeed at resolving their problem, only to see circumstances turn the story the other way. Sequence 4 is a long one, to the point that I may be in error here by just a little bit, and I might be letting it overlap into sequence 5, but stay with me. Back in the kitchen, after Ralph leaves the picture, we learn about the emergency generator which Jack powers on. From there, Jack and Marcy fool around while Ned watches them from a distance before following a stranger to his untimely end off-screen. The wind shifts and a thunderstorm approaches, which is the perfect excuse for Jack and Marcy to head into their cabin, to bang. Before they do, however, Marcy reflects on a dream she keeps having wherein rain turns to blood, a dream which, much like her life, will have an anticlimactic ending.
And the rain turns to blood. And blood washes away in little rivers.
This is one of the more haunting moments in the franchise, and one which I don't feel gets talked about enough. Anyway, Jack and Marcy do the horizontal shuffle, not realizing that poor Ned's body has been stashed in the bunk above them.
Jack and Marcy are gonna get drenched.
Not if they're where I think they are.
Back at the Comanche cabin, the other three, Bill, Brenda, and Alice, play strip Monopoly, smoke grass, and drink beer. It's worth noting for those who give way too much credence to slasher formula rules that Alice partakes in the devil's lettuce. It's okay though, she'll pay for her transgressions in part 2. Sequence 4 culminates in the killings of Jack and Marcy, both of whom receive the most violent on-screen deaths in the picture. Now, sure enough, we are now privy to the fact that our protagonist, Alice, has a far more difficult task ahead of her, surviving the night. The dramatic question at the top of the film is whether the counselors will succeed in reopening the camp, and it would seem that this is actually the least of their concerns. These acts of violence, finishing up at nearly 47 minutes in, lead us into sequence 5. We're now down to 3 characters, 4 if you count Steve Christie, who for now is a suspect in the eyes of the first-time viewers. As the storm rages outside, Brenda heads back to her cabin to close the windows and get some shut-eye.
Just when it was getting interesting.
On her way, she neglects to put her clothes back on, presumably because it's the tail end of the 70s and people just like being naked. We're then gifted a leave from the camp to visit with Steve Christie, who finishes up at a diner and shows himself to be a good-hearted dude who just wants the best for his counselors.
They are babes in the woods in every sense of the word.
Galino notes that, quote, during the next 15 or so minutes, the protagonist works on whatever new complication arose at the first culmination. He goes on to mention that, quote, this is a place in the story in which new characters are introduced and new opportunities present themselves. And sure enough, Christie is picked up by yet another suspect, Sergeant Tierney, who will go on to give him a ride out to the camp. Tierney doesn't have a huge role, but he does get the second-to-last lines of the picture, so there's that. Now, Sequence 5 is also usually home to subplots, or the B-story, and in a slasher movie, that generally takes the form of a good old stock-and-slash sequence, which we get with Brenda. She hears what sounds like a young boy crying for help, goes to investigate, and whoops-a-doodle, gets murdered down at the archery range. Side note, what's the deal with Brenda and rain? She seems uniquely interested in getting as wet as possible. Unfortunately, she never gets a chance to get a chill, and her screams are drowned out by the continuing storm. Sequence 6 is the final sequence of Act 2, and therefore it's not a surprise that it packs quite a bit of material. It starts off at around 57 minutes with Brenda's death and continues through to her body being thrown through the window at an hour 15, aka our all is lost moment, wherein Alice is now by herself and seemingly well and truly fucked. The way Galeno describes this sequence is actually kind of funny, explaining that, quote, the protagonist, having eliminated all the easy potential solutions and finding the going most difficult, works at last toward a resolution of the main tension, and the dramatic question is answered. And sure enough, the going is most difficult, and we see that the generator is dead, and so are all of Alice's new friends. Sequence 7, which, quote, brings forth new and even more difficult problems, starts with a Jeep pulling up at the hour 15 mark, which Alice assumes to be Steve Christie. But instead she's presented with a Mrs. Voorhees out of nowhere.
How are you? Well, I'm Mrs. Voorhees, an old friend of the Christies.
Here, Alice must deal with the ultimate consequence of her decision to try and hold out on the camp by coming face to face with a killer. The main point of this sequence is to establish Mrs. Voorhees, with the question of whether or not she can be trusted rapidly getting an answer at an hour 18. Thus begins our big third act chase, wherein Alice discovers the bodies of Annie and Steve Christie. Now, if there's one point where the delineation between sequences gets really messy, it's here between 7 and 8. For our purposes, I'm cutting off sequence 7 at Alice giving Mrs. Voorhees a beatdown at an hour 22, as this feels like the moment where Alice comes into her own and more or less takes control of the situation, something she wanted to do back when her only problem was maybe Steve being a bit lecherous. Anyway, in sequence 8, Alice returns to the kitchen where Brenda's body was thrown through the window. With no real alternative to get out of the camp, she hides in the pantry, which, yes, is a little daft, considering she'd be better off hiding in the darkness of the woods, but hey, she's young and scared, so we give her some leeway. Plus, we need a movie. She and Mrs. Voorhees have another struggle, and Alice runs off to the lake, where we get our final battle, resulting in Betsy Palmer losing her head at an hour 28. Alice returns to the lake, home to some of her last good memories before getting dragged down into the depths by a young Jason Voorhees, only for it to be a dream. In the hospital, she's told by Tierney that everyone is dead and that there was no boy.
Ma'am, we didn't find any boy.
Implying that there's still more bad luck to come for anyone who dares to try to return to Camp Crystal Lake. Thus, at an hour 32, our picture ends. Now, as you can see, while critics may have been harsh with Friday the 13th when it was released, screenwriter Victor Miller actually put together a pretty tight script that adequately gets across all of its central themes and questions. If I have one big qualm, it's that while mystery pieces are set up, they're done so in such a way that first-time watchers could easily miss them. I definitely never thought the cops were up to anything or that Christie was in on the murders, and so there's a bit of a lack of tension throughout that's only made more befuddling with the random reveal of Mrs. Voorhees, a character we've had zero reference to. It feels a bit cheap, like Miller took the lack of mystery from Halloween as an easy way out of writing a coherent murder mystery. But despite that, I continue to appreciate Friday the 13th. It wouldn't be the first movie I'd pick up to rip off if I wanted to write a great slasher film, but there's a lot aspiring writers can learn from Miller's work. So I recommend you all smoke a bowl and rewatch Friday the 13th. You just might learn something. Go watch a movie.
It's gonna take me some time to give you all that is mine. I'm looking ultra fine from your view from behind. It's gonna take me some time to give you all that is mine. I'm looking ultra fine from your view from behind. Far as my phone, work and play out. You got what's coming, you gonna shout. Sit right down, boy, hands in a cup. I'm gonna show you exactly what's up. Gonna give you that booty flavor. You're loving my booty flavor. Straight savage. Booty flavor. All over you. Booty flavor. Yeah.
Wee, my hair's fucked up. The first is if we consider Alice's problem to be whether or not she'll stay on... damn, I'm fucking sucking dicks left and right here. Am I off center? God damn it. That's irritating. The other way we could take this is that the first attempt is frosted. I almost said frosted. That was rough. I immediately regret wearing this shirt. I'm so hot. Does it look like I'm just messing with my penis here? Because you can't see my hands. I'm doing this. But I just realized that it does not translate.